Hi, everybody. Last week, I had a great discussion, postdoctoral fellow and two fourth-year graduate students at the Riley Center for Science, Technology, and Medicine in their cultural context at Notre Dame University. We covered a lot of ground. We asked questions like, how can science and feminist thought be mutually beneficial? How can we have hard conversations about differing worldviews? Why do theories about the binary nature of gender refuse to die? We discussed how scientists and social activists have worked together to co-produce new knowledge. And I offered some modest comments on how to do interdisciplinary work in the academy, and I answered a few personal questions. I hope that the conversation is of use to you.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to our panel today, a conversation on a life of gender and science with Dr. Ann Fausto Sterling. My name is Lindsay Breitweiser, and I am postdoctoral fellow of gender studies and affiliate of the Riley Center for Science, Technology, and Values at the University of Notre Dame. I'm excited to facilitate this afternoon's conversation on the struggle for gender and racial justice through science with our distinguished visitor, Dr. Ann Fausto Sterling. Before I introduce my conversation partners, I'd like to thank Pam Butler for her willingness to run our tech today. Thank you also to the faculty and staff of the Gender Studies program and the Riley Center for Science, Technology, and Values for sponsoring today's event. The collaboration between these programs, as well as Dr. Fausto Sterling's work, highlights the importance of interdisciplinary pursuits in the academy and the capacity for science and feminist thought to be mutually beneficial. I'm so grateful to be a part of both programs, so thank you again to everyone who's helped bring this together. I'd also like to take a moment to acknowledge that while we are in a shared virtual space, we still occupy territory that has been used and continues to be used for life and knowledge production by Indigenous peoples. So I want to recognize the history and continuous presence of the Potawatomi, Miami, and Peoria peoples, as well as other First Nations who've resided in and moved through this area. Since our conversation today is intended to speak to identity and scientific enterprise, we should remember that Western science and biomedicine have indeed been used as tools of colonialism and violence, and it's our continued duty to seek justice for our community. Today's event is an open discussion with Dr. Fausto Sterling about her life, her career, intellectual pursuits, and what she hopes will have come from her decades of work in biology and feminist science and technology studies. While my panelists and I will be leading the conversation, we encourage you to take advantage of our venue and use Zoom's Q&A function. Having such a multidisciplinary audience will lead to a wonderful conversation, so please pose your questions there. And you can also like one another's comments so that you can bump it up to the top and we can see what questions want to be asked. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce my fellow discussants, Shar Brechovic and Fayaza Fazali, Fafa for short. Shar and Fafa are both fourth-year PhD candidates on the philosophy track in History and Philosophy of Science, and they're both minoring in gender studies. Shar explores the role of social kinds in medical research, as well as the links between imagination and health behaviors in patients diagnosed with chronic medical conditions. Fafa's research focuses on the relationship between science and values and the social and scientific understandings of the concept of sex. We are honored to be here and so happy to have our audience with us as we celebrate the life and work of our primary conversation partner, Dr. Ann Fausto Sterling. Dr. Fausto Sterling is Nancy Duke Lewis Professor Emerita of Biology and Gender Studies at Brown University and Fellow of the American Association for the Advancement of Science. She is a leading expert in biology and gender development and has written 3 acclaimed books and over 60 scholarly articles on gender, sexuality, race, and science. She's also a regular contributor to and resource for leading media outlets who are educating their audiences about the connections between social systems and scientific knowledge, including the New York Times, PBS, and the Boston Review. She's currently applying dynamic systems theory to the study of gender differentiation in early childhood, exposing the flawed underpinnings of the nature versus nurture debate. Dr. Fausto Sterling, welcome, and thank you for joining us this afternoon.
Thank you. A special thanks to you, Lindsay, for making all of this happen. It was originally going to be an in-person visit last fall, and then things happened that made that impossible. So I'm really glad we've been able to regroup and do it this spring.
Yes, thank you so much. And thanks to everybody for being willing to do this online. I know it's tough in the current circumstances, but we are very appreciative of our ability to access Dr. Fausto Sterling and this venue online. So thanks, everybody. Dr. Fausto Sterling, I thought I might throw out the first question for you to get our conversation going. Certainly for we discussants, and I'm sure for plenty of our audience members, your work has served as such an inspiration. And what's been so wonderful is that you've worked across a variety of topics and fields: genetics, feminist theory, anatomy, science studies. And I'm wondering if you might start us off by speaking to what you believe you've pursued as your primary questions or goals in your career.
Well, I guess my primary question in a way hasn't changed. That is, my primary question in terms of the science is the question of development. And I was especially intrigued by this in college and undergraduate school when I took an embryology course, and I was stunned by what the embryo did to move from a single cell to a visible organism. And I thought, well, that's what I want to study. But of course, development takes many different forms. And for many years, I did study it in embryos, and fly embryos, in fact. But as circumstances around me changed and as my interests changed, I've broadened out to be interested in development in a number of different venues. And that meant making side trips into things like, how does science work in the first place? Because there were some kinds of questions I confronted that I couldn't answer without addressing that. So a lot of different side channels followed along the way. I think I'm back to studying development in terms of the work I'm doing now on infants and gender development. Only now I'm not studying flies, I'm studying little babies. Who knew?
Dr. Fausto Sterling,
yeah,
thank you so much for being with us today. I was thinking that how much the areas of your academic work are socially important. For instance, the binary view of sex that you have extensively argued against has resulted in many unnecessary and painful surgeries and complications in the lives of many intersex people. So of course you want to see that your work actually contributes to positive changes in society. But for this to happen, it seems necessary for people in academia to effectively communicate with the public. I wanted to know about your personal experience in public engagement, and also about what you think is important in these kinds of communications.
Yeah, it's hard to separate that question from my sort of general political engagement in the world. I mean, it makes me think back to, and this will, all of you younger people, your eyes may glaze over, but it makes me think back to the mid 1960s when I was a college student, and we were trying to convince people that it was a bad idea for Kennedy to send troops to Vietnam. And the question was, how did we convince people of that, and how did we talk to people of that? And so we spent, I don't see that question as sort of how do we communicate our political ideas to various audiences as being different from how do we communicate what we think the science is saying. And I think the struggle for me more specifically has been to find venues that, as a scientist, to find venues that are more accessible to people in general, when the accepted venue within a field is, at least in science, is usually to write a completely unintelligible academic paper. And then doing the crossover from that writing an article or giving a talk that is intelligible, and that still does justice to the complexities of the science has been the struggle. And that's been, for me, a process of practice and then finding venues. I think these days it's ever more easier because of the proliferation of online things. I mean, you can go out and create a YouTube channel and you can do a recording every other night and post it up there and post your pictures and whatever, that you have direct access and the potential to build an audience of followers now that didn't exist maybe even 10 years ago, but certainly didn't exist longer than that. So I think actually we're in a golden age of using the new communication technology to really build an audience for ideas that we think are important.
I'm wondering, Dr. Fausto Sterling, if you might speak to some of those conversations you may have had before about your work. We got an audience question before the event about your engagement with the public especially. Are there moments where you find that people challenge your studies or your findings or misunderstand your work? And how have you maybe had some of those hard conversations that have been correcting someone's entire worldview of gender, sex, sexuality, and race?
Well, there's a lot of this going on right now with regard to in fact, there was even something in a big kerfuffle in the U.S. Congress today about between two Congress people about one who put out a trans liberation flag and the other one who put out something about science and gender and truth. But that debate is going on like crazy on Twitter, and my work gets invoked either on either side of the debate, and it's kind of astounding to watch it. But I think Twitter's a poor format for trying to actually have a decent conversation. So when I see something like that happening on Twitter, I tend to pull back and say, all right, can I write a somewhat longer piece that addresses the issues? I did that, for example, with a piece I published, I think last winter in the Boston Review, on these debates about sex and gender and trans rights, and which are particularly strong and are being used in, I think, a pretty reprehensible way by the right wing right now to argue against any LBGT rights, but in a way that's reminiscent of the arguments that were used against the Equal Rights Amendment back in the 80s, if I get my decade right, where it was still, then it was about bathrooms too. I mean, it's like bathroom seems to be the thing that scares people or that they just can't wrap their mind around. So I figure a few things. There are a certain amount of the debate is by ideologues who have no interest in being convinced or hearing rational argument. And there's nothing much you can do about that. I mean, I think one thing to do is to figure out when to stop talking to those people. Although there are the few people who can sort of carry on an extended one-on-one conversation and maybe change your mind. I'm not one of them. But those people exist and they are to be treasured. But I think there's a whole middle ground of people who just are like watching a tennis match and they don't know what to do. They see the ball going back and forth, but they don't know what to think. And those people, I think you can engage in that. What you have to do is sort of say, follow me off of Twitter and let's go look at either this book or this article, or sometimes I use Twitter a lot the way I used to use the classroom, in that I think you can bring people to resources and then they have to use them or not. And that if I cannot use my authority to change someone's mind, because that's a useless exercise. But so I sometimes say, here are 3 good things to read, and just put the links on Twitter. And I think I think it's unrealistic to think you can do more than that in any one moment of debate or in the classroom. I mean, honestly, if once you all have taught long enough, you'll know that you can't necessarily change people's mind just by telling them they're wrong. In fact, you probably can't do that. But you can put a kind of a plate of fruit in front of them and say, sample this and sample that and see, and if they're willing to really be a little adventuresome, then they may start to think differently.
Yes, on this point, I'm sorry that the sun has decided to attack me here. It should
Well,
just go away in a second.
I'm good. You may be a little blind, but
okay. But yes, as Fafa said, thank you so much for being here and taking our questions. And on the point that you just made, one thing that I think has astounded me over the past couple of years in graduate school is being reminded how many people are still committed to, as you said, very traditional biological views of human sex. And it seems to me that the biological view of sexual dimorphism is almost like a theory that just refuses to die. It's almost as if, whenever you find an argument to undercut, some of the background assumptions that are made, it's as if some of these people who are proponents of the view will find clever strategies to revive it. And so one question I have for you is, from your perspective, what do you think is going on here? And why is this traditional view so resilient? And in particular, have you observed some disciplines that seem to be more recalcitrant to, say, the spectrum view of sex that you've put forward versus others that seem to be more accepting? Let me move my
yeah, so there could be a lot of different things going on. Some of them are, just to give people a little bit the benefit of the doubt, some of them involve things that seem like common sense. So some of the ideas I think that I and others are arguing fly in the face of sort of common daily observation. I'm an avid bird watcher. I'm doing a lot of photography, and I look out my window and there's a male bluebird and a female bluebird, and they're pretty clearly different looking. Or a male cardinal and a female. So you see a lot of dimorphism in the world. You also see a lot of dimorphism among humans in the world in terms of if you're a parent raising kids, you may, plenty of the argument from a sample of one or two is frequent, and I get this at the end of a lot of lectures. Well, my son was playing ball by the time he was 3, and my girl loved Barbies. And I'm like, that's probably true, but so people are observing their own children, but they're not asking that question of sort of how did they get to the point where they love to play ball or love Barbie. So I think at one level you're working against common observations that are not, they're not wrong, they just don't go far enough. They don't go beyond the I see this to ask how did this happen. And I think you see that across disciplines, and you see it in the classroom and in people who are just talking to you. So the debates on Twitter just get stupid sometimes, and they're like, well, men have sperm, and I'm like, yeah, they do. But that's and so people do have a hard time getting past that. But the resistance to it can also be at other levels. I see it in a group of senior sexologists that I communicate with, and when I say senior, a lot of them are my age or also otherwise a little younger, but still in their 60s and 70s, and they've spent a lifetime studying sex and gender from a particular point of view, and now they are being asked to jettison that point of view and look at it really differently. It's not just a question of saying, oh no, there's not 2, there's 3. It's a question of saying, I have to look at the whole structure differently. And to that group of people, it sounds like I mean, it is saying, I have to rethink a lifetime of work. And coming to terms with that. So, I mean, sometimes people yell at me because I published something in 1975 and I don't say the same thing anymore. And I'm like, well, whatever, that's what I was thinking in 1975. But for some people, that's pretty hard to do. And sometimes they're being asked to do it under duress. That is, they may be facing hostile activists who are really calling them out in a way that I think sometimes maybe isn't even fair to them. I mean, that doesn't give them the benefit of having come up being there. I think of John Money as an example of someone who's no longer alive, but who ended his life in disgrace for a number of reasons, but who at the beginning of his work really was revolutionary in terms of asking people to look at sex and gender, trying to define it, raising questions of development. And yet by the end of his life, he couldn't let go of how he'd started his life. And it also took an unethical turn in terms of the science that he did. But you can see at one level how he got stuck. And he got stuck at some point intellectual, and he couldn't get unstuck, and he just dug himself into a hole. And I think that happens to a lot of people. So it's I'm asking people to change. When I say I'm asking you to stop looking at a sort of unitary binary way of looking at things and instead looking at dynamics and development, I'm really asking people to swap out a whole worldview. And that's really a hard ask. So I think there's a lot of resistance for those reasons as well. And for some people underlining it, I don't mean to say there isn't also a lot of racism, sexism, homophobia. I mean, that also is in there to different degrees with different people, more or less conscious, but it's there too. And it's at the heart. I'm reading some history right now of developmental psychology for a paper I'm writing. And what you can, and the history of child development in the 1930s, there was just, when you actually look at the literature, just wrapped in there and not even worthy of commentary, is the most racist stuff. And it was just part of the way of looking at the world. And the same people, if they were alive today and have gone through the various transformations many of us had, I would probably be pretty embarrassed by it. And the field simply doesn't quote it, but it's there, and it's wrapped into the field in various ways. So a lot of these standard fields also just have a history of a set of racist and sexist assumptions that have to be dug out and exposed and acknowledged in order to change.
I'm wondering if you might speak a little bit more to that point, Dr. Fausto Sterling. One of the pieces that you've written, that's one of my favorites, is this article called "The Bare Bones of Race," in which you're contesting the idea of race neutral science or gender neutral science. Could you speak a little bit more about what you were saying just now, and about this idea of race neutral science and how you see scientists as both agents of power, but also agents of change?
Yeah, that's such a tricky one, isn't it? I mean, because right now, I mean, it's been brought to the fore in such a way because science has become so much a part of our, even being pro-science or anti-science, so much a part of our politics. But I mean, maybe if we dig in with something like public health, we see the science of public health being a very powerful science to talk about how to contain a pandemic, how to maintain how to control a pandemic, how to stop spread, and at the same time, woven into it is a complete inability to deal with communities of color. So I'm looking at Massachusetts, which is this, one of the most liberal states in the country. and it's been quite good about its rules about wearing masks and, you know, restricting gatherings and all, but it cannot manage to distribute the vaccine. And it can't manage to distribute the vaccine because woven into government is no knowledge, or there is no knowledge woven into government of communities of color, how they work, how they access medicine. So there's no plan to have local pharmacies, local health clinics. Everybody is, you want your shot, go to this giant football stadium. You know, I live in a very rural area out here on Cape Cod, and there's been essentially no vaccine coming out here, even though they're telling people, and it's got one of the highest concentrations of people over 75 in the country. And people who can drive, they can drive off Cape for an hour and go to Gillette Stadium in Foxborough and get their shot. People who can't have no way to get the shot because there's no local distribution. And yet we have a system of community health clinics, but the public health, the science of public health, as it's been operating for the last 20 or 30 years, doesn't know how to use community health clinics and doesn't recognize that that's a primary way you get anything you need to a rural population. So you have these things going on simultaneously where on the one hand, there's a lot of good science being done. And on the other hand, the sort of social science aspect of it is impossibly bad. I don't know if that helps or not, but.
Well, it gives us some insight, I think, into your work has really focused on how we come to embody our identities and how our biophysiology is working with the social aspects, but also in your comments just now, I mean, thinking about the bureaucracy that's involved that is also serving as a barrier. I mean, things like medical education or distribution of vaccines, knowing, having the built-in knowledge in government to know how different communities access or cannot access healthcare. I mean, I think those are very important points to take away from that.
Talking about the lives of marginalized people in different terms. I mean, those who have been marginalized due to their sex or race or other actually factors. I was thinking, and I wanted to ask a question that about what you think about the intersection of problems of intersex people and other LGBTQ communities. Do you think, for instance, if I just want to concentrate on the trans right people and scholars who have done lots of good works to do some help for them. Do you think the scholars who have working on non-binary understanding of sex are facing obstacles similar to those that scholars working on trans rights have faced? And if yes, then what do you think are the main lessons that the first group should learn from trans rights?
What
Scholars
kind of obstacles do you have in mind? Because I'm not sure understanding the direction of your question.
Right. The first thing that comes to my mind is about how scientific establishment facing and talking and discussing the new scientific findings. Like a few decades ago, trans community was labeled as, maybe not mentally healthy people, or and other actually groups in LGBTQ communities. And then it took a long time for scholars, for the general scholars, to accept those kind of scholarships that parallel with human rights and more progressive view of scientific works. So I am thinking that when it comes to like intersex scholarship, in terms of like laws and rights that they have all around the world, even in the United States, they are kind of they didn't have. They are behind comparing to some of the other groups in LGBTQ communities. And I feel that this comes from the progress that other groups could have comes from some backup of scientific communities. This is not the case yet for intersex communities. That was why I was thinking that
that's an interesting. I'm wondering if the progress does come from the backup, or rather it's the reverse. That is that the activist groups have pushed scholars to develop a backup. So when I think of things like what happened, the removal of homosexuality from the diagnosis of mental illness, and the similar set of things that's been happening with various trans identities, the sort of restriction in the DSM of just gender dysphoria as a rather narrow, specific thing, that hasn't happened because there's been scientific backing for it, but that hasn't happened because scientists decided through their scholarship that should happen. Rather, there were organized activist groups and individual activists who influence specific scholars to begin to change their points of view. So I think the interesting thing here is, and there's been some decent histories, I think, about the change in the APA with regard to homosexuality. I think the history of trans diagnoses rights is still being written. It's still happening, and I think, but I think what you have is an interplay, a sort of co-construction of a new scholarship, in which scientists are helping and looking at things different, but they've been induced to look at things differently because non-scientists have been pushing them. And I'm sure they've pushed back at the non-scientists too, but that there's a kind of, you should forgive me, dynamic interaction that goes on with that change in scholarship. And these aren't separate groups, but they're co-producing new knowledge about these ways of being. And the more they co-produce, the more the ways of being can come into existence and become visible in the culture. So it's a kind of continuum of process that's happening. And with regard to intersex, I mean, I think intersex is particularly difficult, both because of the numerology. Well, it's for several of the numerology. There are fewer intersex people probably than there are gay people, for example, as a percent of the population. They are way less visible, and just even socially way less. I mean, you didn't even have secret intersex bars. I mean, wasn't a kind of social community out of which activism grew. And intersex is a kind of diverse category because there are many different syndromes, if you will, or differences of sexual development that that lead to that fall within the general category of intersex. And if you look at, which maybe you have, the different, like different societies of people who say, the Society for Androgen Insensitivity, or I don't have that name quite right, but versus a Turner syndrome organization. They have very different senses of self, very different senses of whether they want to even go in the direction of a kind of separate identity called intersex. And so you don't have a coherence within that umbrella of people we call intersex either, except maybe around the single question of infant surgery. So that makes the whole organizing for intellectual change and social change much more complicated.
Thank you.
And if you look at it, back to the Twitter that's been going on, I mean, there are a bunch of, within, particularly in England, the whole debate about girls' rights versus trans rights, and there are a whole bunch of intersex people mixed right in that too somehow, and I can't quite figure out even what their position is, but some of them are clearly advocating for a binary point of view, and some of them are not. So I think there's a lot to be unraveled there to figure out the actual answer to your question.
Yeah, thank you so much.
You're welcome.
Speaking on that, you were gesturing to some ideas about changes over time, how the landscape in terms of political acceptance and activism and understandings among scientists have changed. I'm wondering if you have recognized any palpable changes in the way that scientists have focused on gender and sex over the course of your career. And also we had an audience question that was similar. Folks wanted to know how your own thoughts and questions might have shifted over time. You mentioned before some language differences that you would, now you wouldn't write in these particular terms as you did then. But yeah, I think people are really curious about the changing trajectories and seeing some of this positive development.
Right. Well, first of all, I think each general field requires a different answer. So the field of psychology, for example, which in the 70s was maybe writing about women in psychology and was just beginning to think hard about gender development and sex and gender, has gone through a whole long period of really trying to parse out different categories, using words like sex to mean only the biological basics. And then gender, they've had to divide up into a bunch of different things: identity, roles, gender expression, and have really worked to study these sort of separately and asked how they interact. And I'm now in the midst of writing things where I argue that they have to be brought back together as a component of identity. In other words, that identity isn't a simple thing at all, but it's a sort of complex process that involves both expression and, oh, kitty. That involves both expression, identity, and roles, and that those are sort of circulating. Identity is something that involves the sort of constant circulation of these aspects of gender. So really, to do that, you have to bring in a new language. If you have fields if you have the general field of, say, gender and medicine, which is a very different field, it still works on we have your gender and we have your sex, and those are separate concepts. And getting the medical field to even do that is hard. So, it's really common to read in the medical literature or in the biological literature, someone talk about gender in flies. And they mean sex the way most of us use the word. But so in some fields, there had that the language that was brought into the conversation by feminists and also by scholars like John Money, of gender versus sex, it never penetrated, and it's currently a big struggle to get medicine to understand it. So different, very uneven development in different fields. I myself have stopped. I'm now, when I'm talking about humans, I try to stay away from that gender sex binary, because I've become more and more to feel that almost all aspects of our existence are a combination of the two. And so I started using, which I'll also talk about a bit more tomorrow in the fancy talk, about that gender and sex are constantly, that they are a co-construction. And so I'm using this this gender/sex term pretty exclusively, and there are only a few places where I think you have, quote, pure sex, and a few places where you have pure gender. But I have basically, unless you really believe in a mind-body separation, which I don't. In other words, I think our mind is part of our body, and it's part of our nervous system functioning and our neuromotor, neurosensory functioning. That when we're doing things that we think of as some aspect of a sex difference or a gender expression, that we're always feeding back on the body, and the body is in turn feeding back on the identity, on what's in the mind. So I've almost always stopped speaking of them separately.
You have, by the way, this beautiful phrase in your newest edition of Sexing the Body, where you mention gender sex as a changing river that flows throughout the life cycle. And I found that imagery really beautiful and a lovely metaphor for encapsulating what you just said about the blending of science and society, or biology and social relations, all the time throughout our lives. And I want to gesture to that you have an addition out, and it's beautiful.
Oh, good. Well, I do have a whole new chapter on how I'm thinking now about things in the new edition. So it may be worth people ponying up for it. I won't speak to your pocketbooks, but there is a fair amount of new material in it. And that river metaphor is a process metaphor. It's not an uncommon one for people who do dynamic systems theory, because the thing, and this gets back to me as a developmentalist, the thing about thinking about any of these things as a process is that you always have the time element. It's never you can take a cross section, but it's a peak. It's like a slice of the bread, and you're never looking at the whole loaf that way. So how do you understand, what are good ways, and this gets back to the question you asked me, sort of how do you communicate this to a general audience? Dynamic systems is not an easy way. I'm saying don't look at things in a binary way. Don't look at the world as nature versus nurture. Instead, look at it in this really complicated way of things always changing with time and nothing static, and you have process, and people are like, what? So the more you can give people metaphors that help them think about it, the better. I'm going to introduce one I'm playing with right now tomorrow that comes from literary theory, actually. But I'm married to a playwright, and I've been hearing her talk for years about literary theory, about the theories about structure of plays, and I finally thought, oh wow, this could really be a useful way of thinking about it here. So I'm going to have a little literary theory in case you have any English or literature people out there.
We do.
I'll be throwing them a bone tomorrow at the end. But so I'm always looking for ways of conceptualizing what I'm trying to say, because at the heart of dynamic systems theory is a lot of really complicated mathematical equations, and I'm not particularly skilled at them myself. And they certainly don't help communicate to a larger audience what I'm talking about. So rivers and sandbars and changing formations and things are one useful metaphor, I think.
So talking about sexing the body, it's now more than 2 decades old. And I think everybody agrees that it is now a classic work in studying human sex, and especially in intersex studies. Now, when you go back and think about publishing the book, what do you think are the major reasons for the success of sexing the body? And also, I wanted to say that I decided to work on the topic of intersex after reading your works, and specifically sexing the body. So the other question that I want to ask is, your works brought me to work on intersex. So what brought you into working on intersex? There was any specific things or not?
Yeah, well, that the second question is easy to answer because there was a pretty clear line, and it really came out of developing women's studies. So in the early 70s, there was no such thing as women's studies, or as it was called at the time, and yet it was sort of beginning to exist all over. And we began to at Brown, where I was, we developed the first women's studies course, and that was, taught by an historian, an anthropologist, and a biologist, and whatever. There were a whole group of us, and it was during that process of thinking about women's studies and thinking about then what does it mean for biology, and at the same time, my regular teaching was in embryology. I was teaching an embryology course, and I always had a segment on the development of the urogenital system. And I taught what I felt at the time was the most progressive thing to be teaching, which was the work of John Money and Anke Ehrhardt. So I taught urogenital development, and I taught, just much as I portrayed it in a number of things, of the similarities and where of the unity of the early developmental onlage, the early developmental parts of the body, and how they diverge in one direction or the other. And that alone always amazed students, that you started with the absolutely the same structures, and then some of them either grew and some didn't, or some, basically some structures grew and developed and others didn't. And then I added in some of the case studies on intersex particularly as they were portrayed in Money and Earhart's book, Man, Woman, Boy, and Girl, which is a classic book on this topic. And then I began, because of my engagement with the politics of women's studies and the politics of feminism, to begin to ask, well, are they being determinist? Are they not being determinist? And because they have a little of each in that book. And then I have to say, it was one of those eureka moments where, and we were also discussing the concept of social construction. So it was pretty easy to see how history was socially constructed, or an analysis of literary work was socially constructed, but how is the body socially constructed? And I can just sort of picture it one morning or afternoon, whenever my class was, and I was lecturing on Ehrhardt and Money's discussions of intersex bodies, and I was like, oh my God, this is a social construction. And it was from there, I mean, it was just like that. I suddenly, a whole different way of looking at this material I've been teaching for years just sort of opened up. And it was because of the other sort of offstage conversations I'd been having with people in different disciplines. And from there, I said, well, this is, something worth writing on. What is the medical construction of going on here? And so I went back and reread all of the original medical papers and it just sort of, the stuff was just there to be, it was lying on top of the, you didn't have to dig deep to find it. And from that, I wrote the, the 5 sexes essays and began really working with students on the more detailed intersex. And about that same time, I was contacted by Cheryl Chase, who was the founder of the Intersex Society of North America. And she was just starting to reach out. And this is where I say scholars and activists work together. She was just starting to reach out to scholars and also become an activist, an intersex activist herself. And we had, I recently, because I touched base with her recently when I wrote the revised edition of Sexing the Body, because I wanted to make sure she agreed with my update or had other insights into my updates. And she dug out a whole bunch of our correspondence. It was in the early days of email, but we were back and forth. We had enormous long discussions, which now are available at the Pembroke Archives if you ever want to dig into them. But about strategy and content and the politics of surgery and just a million other things. And so that in the years leading up to the publication of Sexing the Body, I had students doing research projects. I mean, I dug into lots of stuff, but it was really that moment stimulated by the early development of women's studies where I was lecturing on stuff I'd always lectured on. And I was like, oh my God, look at what this is. It was just like a eureka moment. Now, of course, I've forgotten the first part of your question.
The first part actually was about what you think are the reasons for the, this acceptance of the book among scholars, and that made the book to be like a base, basic for the basis for the whole scholarship in intersex.
In a way, it's not for me to say, but if I'm going to make a guess, I'm going to say, based on my interaction with colleagues at Brown, that I provided, I think there wasn't a sensible discussion of biology up until then. By sensible, I mean, it's not that I'm non-ideological, because I'm certainly ideological, but it was, maybe the discussions of sex and gender up until then were oversimplified. And even, even in the earlier book, Myths of Gender, I was still maintaining sex versus gender and those basic constructions. But what I ran up against there was that there were things that it really didn't explain about how science itself worked. And so in Sexing the Body, I really began to weave in the function of science and how science produced knowledge. And that was interesting to a much broader. So I wasn't just saying, here's the truth about what biology says, and here's how you can use it sociologically, but I'm like, here is how knowledge about the body comes into being. And I think people appreciated having the tools to think about it. So I think it offered a set of tools. So, because there's a lot in that book that isn't about intersex. But in each case, it's sort of, how could you think about sex hormones? How could you think about the brain? How could you think about these different aspects that are normally just assigned to being the body and sex, but how could they be both real and material and also socially constructed? And how could we find a way of thinking about that? And I think people found that helpful.
On this point, is it okay?
Yeah.
Okay. In your recent work, you offer the concept of gender/sex, which builds on your own research as well as the work of other feminist science and technology studies scholars, philosophers of science, that shows the entanglement of biology with social practices. And I was wondering if you could take a moment to talk about what you intended this phrase to do, what was it functioning to do, and how it expands our knowledge of identity and embodiment.
Well, I certainly intended it to get people to, I certainly intended and intend to get people to stop parsing the world in terms of either gender or sex. So I wanted and want to people stop thinking about those oppositionally, in terms of thinking about themselves that way, but also in terms of how you think about what we're doing when we design a research project. So for scholars, I think, and again, a lot of this is aimed at the medical world, but for scholars who design things where they're like, well, we're going to measure whether some part of the brain lights up under a certain circumstance, and then we'll also, and that'll be our sex, and then we'll also, you know, do a questionnaire about attitudes about women, and that'll be our gender. I just think there was a time when that was an appropriate kind of research to do, but I think that time's gone. So I want to really urge people to stop thinking about the world that way. And so I've had to stop writing about the world that way. And as you'll see tomorrow, I will be using gender sex throughout the lecture, and I'll stop and explain what I mean by it. But I think for some people it will be a stretch still. And for other people will get what I mean right away. There was some other piece to your question. I'm not sure I got to it, but maybe not.
Yeah, and just how it expands our knowledge of identity and embodiment.
Well, yeah, I think it gets us to, again, back to my emphasis on dynamism, I think it gets us to think dynamically about how our gender expression, gender role, identity comes into being at any one moment. What are the things feeding into it? When someone says, well, and not to deny that whatever the feelings or expressions we have, that they're not somewhere on the surface so that we could just shed them if we so chose, which is, you know, that's the old thing about in LBGT world, that people used to frame it as a choice, or you were born that way was a choice of, what's the other word, but at any rate, it's not either you were born that way or it's a choice. It's something way more complicated, but it doesn't mean you can just sort of say, okay, tomorrow I'm not going to feel this way anymore, because if you have a lifetime of a set of behaviors, external responses, internal formations going through they're part of your body, they're part of your neuromuscular system, they're part of your nervous system. They may change slowly over the period of lifetime. In fact, they do. But at any one moment, it's really a part of you, not something on the surface and something inside.
To speak to some of that, and back to one of Fafa's questions, we got a Q&A from Oliver, thank you Oliver, about interdisciplinarity. I think that one of the reasons your work has such staying power and feels so useful to so many people across the sciences, literary studies, feminist theory, social sciences, everywhere, is because of its interdisciplinarity. So Oliver asked, do you have any advice for how scholars might be able to be more interdisciplinary and integrate the humanities and social sciences in their own work, and the hard sciences in their own work?
Well, I think that personally, I'm kind of a scavenger. I see an idea that sort of sounds nice, and I go dig at it, and it probably was used in some totally other way within the discipline, but I try and see whether I can legitimately haul it into what I'm trying to think about. But at various periods in my own development, I've done very conscious interdisciplinary work. So when I took the turn towards embodiment, I was part of, and I sought it out. I was fortunate that Brown and Pembroke had this opportunity, but I ran a year-long interdisciplinary seminar with postdocs from different fields. There was a postdoc from anthropology, and one from philosophy, and one from history, a lot of literary studies people, psychologists, some biologists, And the seminar was to explore the notion of embodiment. And it was out of that actually that the opportunity to do the work studying infant development grew. But it took a year of hard digging. And if you really want to do some interdisciplinary work, it's best, I think, in the course of a lifetime, if you find an opportunity to really work at it with, by getting a seminar together that runs for a year, or getting a sabbatical where you go work with if you're a biologist and you want to go work with a literary theorist. I mean, there are different ways to do it at some concentrated moment when it seems important, because it is necessary to try and develop a common language. I mean, we use like the word embodiment, it gets used so differently in so many different places. So you have to learn just even what you mean by it, because it's a nice sounding word, and then what do you actually mean by it? And other people may mean very different things by it. So learning how to talk across the disciplines requires periodic hard work in an interdisciplinary setting. But for me, it was always driven by a need to push something I was trying to think about in a way where I was stuck, and where it looked like there was an interesting idea across some invisible boundary line.
I love the language of scavenging that you use, scavenging to take what you need from different areas of thought, and creating new knowledge from that to, answer old questions. I just love that metaphor.
And you do have to make sure, I mean, it requires a lot of work. You do have to make sure that you're not sort of messing up the original field you got it from. I mean, just getting it wrong. So you have to get people from different areas to read your work and talk it over. And, I'll read 10 different things in a field for the 1-2 sentence quote that I end up taking, because I want to make sure I'm not taking the quote totally out of context. So it's extra work, but it's fun.
So one additional question that's a follow-up question to that question, from Anna Geltzer from the audience. She writes, I'd like to follow up on that question to ask if you could speak to some of the challenges, structural, intellectual, to that kind of work, and if you have any useful strategies for overcoming them.
But the structural challenges obviously are the disciplinary structure of our universities. I mean, that's the biggest challenge, I think. And so particularly for young scholars coming up, there's an intolerance for moving outside of your boundaries, and the pressures to, if you landed a job, the pressures to keep it by coloring within the lines is how I call it. I've never been very good at that. I was never very good at coloring books. But that's what the pressures are to do. And to some extent, maybe if you have to learn how to be strategic in order to do that without completely alienating people who have the power to keep you employed. But also at most universities, there are interdisciplinary institutes of various sorts, or even sometimes departments like the history and philosophy of science. And there's that, which I gather you have at Notre Dame, right? Isn't that? So there's one like that in Indiana too. I mean, and there's a certain, that already starts as to a certain degree, there's interdisciplinarity within there. Most science studies programs are pretty interdisciplinary and appreciate your knowing some science. So depending on initial choice of area, that's one thing. So it's finding what's available within the structure, but the university is definitely dyed in the wool. It's structured on departments and chairmen and the whole promotion process and the publication. And the biggest, I still face a challenge. I face a challenge with every paper I want to publish of where can I get it published? and I can't tell you how many rejections per publication I get. And the easy rejections are, we won't review this, we don't do this kind of work. And then the question, who does? And well, sometimes within journals, nobody. And so then you have to figure out how to fake it in somewhere. I mean, so that's getting published is, if its work is really interdisciplinary, is another big challenge. Some people are quite good at it because they learn how to dress what they're doing, to disguise what they're doing within the language of the disciplinary journal they want to get published in. And so then they're speaking enough of the same language as their reviewers that they can get it through. I have never been really good at that. So, I mean, once I stopped publishing about fruit flies. So it's always, for me, a struggle to figure out, where can I send a work? How shall I shape it? How much of my own voice should I muffle in order to try and get it through? So that's an ongoing challenge.
Yeah, it I think comes back to some of the points that you've made earlier about how your work and how interdisciplinary work and how work that is questioning some foundational assumptions is political work. And
Yeah.
it takes, a lot of time and a lot of effort and a lot of, I don't know, strength, just general strength to be able to survive in academia in particular, but also to push for certain voices to be heard within fields that maybe aren't always interested in hearing those voices.
Yeah.
And I'm wondering if this might be a good time to talk about feminist theory itself in your work, or maybe not the theories behind academic feminisms and gender studies, but how you're approaching issues of social justice, feminism, politics in your work, and where you see that role being in the academy and in biology.
Sort of tough to answer that in general. I mean, because I haven't so much I think that the feminist theory that I use in my work is not so much around activism and social justice, but although I think it's always in there. It's certainly part of what I espouse, and I don't make that secret. But I don't know, if I were a young scholar starting out today, I think there are labs that really that exist today that really embrace the kind of feminist theory as you've articulated it, Lindsay, in their research structure. And I think of the work that comes out of Sari van Ander's lab, for example, and in which part of her principle, and I was discussing this with a colleague the other day, of sort of, suppose you want to do research on the brains of transgender people. I think, again, gone are the days where you can just invent a theory and go out and find a bunch of transgender people and do a brain scan on them, and not expect to have a lot of people complain very loudly. So if I were wanting to follow those lines, because it's just not what I'm doing right now, but I think that what you would have to do would be to start by having conversations within the transgender community about what kind of knowledge they would like to have about the biological aspects of their existence, and come up with questions that are generated that speak to the needs of the people you're studying. And that doesn't mean not doing rigorous work. It just means having a different community of people formulate the questions. So they're not coming down from Darwin to the present, the question you asked, but are coming from a community of people who want answers and have questions, and who are at the moment, on the whole, so hostile to any medical investigation that there's little that can happen of use. So it would take some really, I think, a careful period of trust building and just listening in order to figure out how to build a research program that would look at, say, the biology of aspects of transgender, and how what would be the right questions to ask, and who would they help, and how would you formulate them. So I think applying activism, the activist aspect of feminist theory, has to, if to say to investigate biological or biomedical questions, it has to start working from the bottom up.
This is such a good point that you're making. I'm thinking of, participatory action research, which is exactly as you say, like going to the communities that academics are seeking to study and understand and build knowledge with, and not, applying theory to them or asking them preconceived questions in order to figure out what's going on, but to work with communities to figure out what questions need to be asked, what services need to be met, what types of knowledge are, these groups hoping to generate, and that being.
There are people doing that. There are journals that publish this kind of work. I mean, there's journals of transgender health, LBGT health journals, which have work that looks like that. And I think it's a new model that's developing, and in certain areas, I think it is a model that should be being used. And maybe that goes back to the intersex questions that Fafa was asking me before too, that's the direction it has to take. So, I mean, I don't have a working lab anymore, so that's why I'm sort of pushing off the research I do is based on videotapes I have in my office on Cape Cod that I can sit and look at. But I no longer have access, because I'm retired, to resources of, a group of students, a university structure for getting institutional review of human subject study. All of those sorts of things are no longer in my, and I'm fine with this. I'm not complaining. I'm just saying it's not where I am in my life cycle right now. But for young scholars starting up, when you have, those are real resources that universities have. And within that structure, you can conceptualize, and people are doing it, new ways of asking questions. And of course, the interdisciplinary questions involve also, you probably can't do a project like that without having an anthropologist, a sociologist, and a biologist or a biomedical person together as a research team, which means you're going to also have to have the interdisciplinary conversations among each other to develop the common language. And that isn't automatic. That would require learning among yourselves as a team how to break through the disciplinary barriers.
Yeah, I think especially thinking about the ways that the sciences can sometimes insist on a form of objectivity that refuses to allow certain types of engagement by their participants or subjects. And
right.
I mean, this speaks to the importance of Oliver and Anna's questions about interdisciplinarity, because that allows these opportunities for better science and more objective science through better question asking and community involvement.
Right. Yeah, and there's no reason why you can't be working with good statisticians and all of that sort of thing while you're doing a project like this. And it doesn't have to, the fact that you're actually talking to your subjects doesn't mean, and that your subjects are part of creating the research, doesn't mean you can't do really quality work. And there is a tradition of this also. If you look at the history of AIDS research, for example, there's a point at which the AIDS community became the mostly men at the time, but also women who were getting sick and dying, became very involved with the researchers, saying, you have to let us be part of the studies and tell you what you need to know. And there's Stephen, I think Epstein has a book called Impure Science, which talks about this in terms of AIDS, but it's happened now with COVID too. I mean, where individual COVID patients are, the ones who are suffering long-term effects, are saying, we're part of this. We have to be part of this, and you have to be listening to our voices as in order to know what questions to ask. So there is a more general history of this within medical science. So it can be done. Right now, the work I'm doing right now, the paper I'm writing is getting away from quantitative work and looking at qualitative work. And and qualitative work lets you have a voice, encourages you to be not objective, but to say what your stance is as a narrator. And there's a whole really strong literature and sets of journals that publish qualitative studies. And so I think one of the things that maybe is underlooked in terms of research in these areas is the development of qualitative studies. There's relatively little of it in these fields that I'm aware of. So
Yes.
it's a really interesting literature. I've just been trying to catch up on it.
So along these lines, talking about your current research and what it would be good to be done, I was wondering, what do you think might be the trajectory of the next generation of scholars in feminist biology and science and technology studies? What insights might you offer them, or questions you hope they will pursue?
I find that you guys are all the ones who are going to know what questions you need to ask. And hopefully I'll still have a flexible enough mind to appreciate what you're asking. So I think the insights I can offer are more along the lines of, offering bibliographies of things I know about, or strategies for wending your way through the university structures. But even there, it's not, the longer I'm retired, the less I know about the current realities. I have loads of younger friends who are at universities I'm on Facebook with, and I'm seeing what they're struggling with in terms of teaching via Zoom and raising their children, and dealing with the public school systems all at once. And my mind reels when I see what they're doing, and I'm like, I don't have any insights from them. I can cheer them on, which I do, but they're facing a world I'm not facing. So it's really, and that's true for academia too. I mean, even younger scientists just within the discipline, the reality of their world is so different from what mine was coming up, is that I'm really not in a position to offer them advice. I can give them hugs. That's worth something, but it's.
I actually have a question for you. Along those lines, since you don't want to give advice, which is fine, because I had a question about advice, but I won't ask that one. So more specifically, because I've always wondered what would Ann Fausto Sterling say to this? I don't know. But in philosophy of science, at least, I've been interested how much pushback I've gotten from philosophers of biology about they'll follow you along and say, yes, fine, sex is vague, and we're willing to grant that there is some, indeterminacy here, and there's various ways in which human beings can instantiate sex properties. That's great. But then what they'll fall back on is they'll say something along the lines of like, look, we should use a cluster conception of sex, such that, the majority of people, vast majority of people, to the point where anybody who doesn't meet these criteria, they're this negligible portion of the population. They fit around this prototype of what sex is in the traditional binary form. And it almost feels like a cop-out of kind of taking your concerns seriously with the spectrum view of sex, but still ultimately falling back on this kind of hidden but not so hidden commitment that there are, in fact, for most purposes, we can talk about a binary. And I was curious if that's just something weird about the metaphysicians I've met at Notre Dame, and philosophers of science and just our discipline, or if this is something that you've
No,
also.
there's a huge debate going on now in the brain sciences about male and female brains. And I don't know if you've followed it, but the work of Daphne Joel, and then the people who argue back against her on this. So it's sort of this, I think it's the same thing. It's like she's basically saying there's no such thing as a male brain or a female brain, but you have individual brains and they have different degrees of this property or that property, only measurable as male or female under a specific circumstance, because a thing that looks like a male behavior or a male neuronal activation under one circumstance in a male body will look like a female instantiation under another circumstances, but in a male body. So is that because the brain keeps changing? And there are the statisticians who argue back against them, do all this fancy statistics, and it's perfectly good statistics to say, look, if we do the following little tricks, we can show that, artificial intelligence can resolve this feature and that feature into clusters that are almost binary. And so it's how does it get worked? It's either, can you tell me which is a male or a female brain by looking at a particular trait in general? I'd have to go reread them. It's actually, the arguments are kind of mind-boggling to me, and I don't hold on to them for long, but I think that's a really good example where exactly this is happening. And it's a question of it's a question of what you're wanting to explain or what you're wanting to understand about the world. So can you use artificial intelligence to form two groups that look pretty binary? And the answer to that probably is yes. You put together a trait like height and bone structure, and you run it through statistics for 10,000 people, and you can come up with two clusters. That's true. But if you go the other way around and say, I'm looking at this person, and this person is 5 foot 10 inches tall and has a skull that's X centimeters thick, is it a male or a female? You can have you can make a guess that's 60% right, likely to be right or not, but it's 40% likely to not be right. So I think that's the same problem. Am I not? So then the question is why?
Yes.
So,
yes.
so why are you wanting to make the distinctions you're wanting to, and why are your colleagues or professors wanting to fall back on this other way of looking at it?
Yes. Yeah, no, that's great. Thank you.
You're welcome.
We're running low on time, so I wanted to ask you as sort of a final question, slightly away from your work, but more about you and how you're doing right now.
Yeah.
Where are you finding joy right now and hope these days, whether that's related to your work and the research and the folks who are taking up feminist science and technology studies, or just in your life? This is a hard time for everybody, so I think
It is a hard time for everybody.
It'd be great to hear where you're finding joy.
Well, I should tell you, I'm sort of pretty naturally an optimistic person. So I don't, in my entire lifetime, I have not spent major parts of it being depressed or unhappy. So that's sort of in my personality. But right this minute, I'm actually excited about the paper that I'm writing, and that's bringing me a lot of joy. And this struggling I've been doing with Russian formalist theories of playwriting and how they apply to infant development and gender, which I'll tell you tomorrow. So that's one whole source. And I think I was saying to you, Lindsay, yesterday that in the beginning of the COVID epidemic, I was kind of stuck. I couldn't get into my work. I was like, suddenly from our racing around the world, I was safe, but I was like, oh my God, is this the end of my life? Which is a way of thinking, when you're my age, it's a thought that comes to mind. because you know you don't have an infinite number of years left. So, and that took me quite a while to break out of that. But what I did then and what I still do now is I can really sink into technological problems. So I started upping my my photography, and I got a new camera. I started, you know, taking more pictures just outside around my house, but also in the area. We live in an area of huge natural beauty. We have a view of the sunset every night. It's totally gorgeous. And I take a lot of joy in bird watching and the photography, and whether I've gotten a successful shot of whatever bird was outside my house. So I think that's the other great place. And then, you know, staying in touch with friends and family. And not so much, but I do a lot on Facebook with friends. I mean, I have a semi-restricted Facebook group that I just, you know, are friends and family and their friends and family. And so I guess that's it.
Do you plan on,
natural world?
do you plan on integrating any of that photography into your next pieces?
Probably not. I don't know. I mean, sometimes I think about, you know, writing a little natural history journal or something, but then I just get involved in something else and don't do it.
Well, Dr. Fausto Sterling, we're so honored and appreciative that you've taken this time to be with us. Gender Studies, the Riley Center for Science, Technology, and Values, and the Notre Dame community, thank you for being here. And I want to thank our panelists and our audience for coming today. I would also like to remind folks that Dr. Fausto Sterling will be presenting some of her recent work tomorrow morning at 10:30 as part of the Riley Center's Educating the Whole Physician speaker series. That talk is entitled The Emergence of Gender/Sex from Interdependence to Identity. And Dr. Fausto Sterling, if you have any words to
thank you for a great conversation, great questions, and again for all the prep work you did to make this happen, and to both Shar and Fafa for their questions, and wish you all good luck on your next adventures.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you
so much, everybody. Thank you for coming again, and we hope to see you all tomorrow.